They say that children see the world differently than adults. We call it imagination or make-believe, a convenient way to dismiss the things that don't fit into our rational understanding of reality. But I've often wondered if the innocence of childhood isn't a lens, but a shield, a barrier that allows kids to interact with things that would shatter the mind of a grown man. I wonder this because of a single, vivid afternoon in the summer of 1998, an afternoon that my family still refuses to discuss to this day. I was 5 years old at the time. My extended family had gathered at Blackwood, my great-uncle Arthur's sprawling estate just outside of Savannah, Georgia. It was one of those oppressive southern summers where the air was so thick with humidity you felt like you were breathing soup, and the sound of cicadas was a constant, deafening buzz that drilled into your skull. Uncle Arthur was the patriarch of the family, a man I idolized. While other adults would pinch my cheeks or talk to me in that annoying, high-pitched baby voice, Arthur treated me with a solemn respect. He was a collector, a man obsessed with time. His study, a forbidden room on the second floor, was filled with hundreds of antique clocks. Cuckoo clocks, grandfather clocks, pocket watches, maritime chronometers. To anyone else, the cacophony of 100 different ticking rhythms would be maddening. To me, it sounded like a heartbeat. It was my favorite place in the world. We had arrived at the estate on a Friday. The atmosphere in the house was strange, stiff, quiet, and suffused with a tension I couldn't understand at 5 years old. My mother's eyes were red-rimmed, and my father spoke in hushed whispers whenever I entered the room. I assumed I was in trouble, or that someone had broken a vase. The reality, as I would learn much later, was far heavier. Lunch was a somber affair. Afterward, the heat became unbearable, and the adults declared it was quiet time. This was the ritual. The adults would retreat to the sunroom to drink iced tea and discuss matters, and the children were ordered to nap in the guest wing. I hated naps. I felt they were a waste of time when there were so many corners of the old house to explore. So I did what any curious 5-year-old would do. I waited until my older cousin Sarah began to snore, and then I slipped out of the bed. The hallway was dim, the heavy velvet drapes drawn against the afternoon sun. I tiptoed across the Persian rugs, my bare feet silent on the wool. I knew exactly where I wanted to go. I wanted to see Uncle Arthur. I wanted to see if he had fixed the Big Ben replica he had promised to show me last Christmas. I reached the heavy oak door of his study at the end of the east wing. Usually, this door was kept locked, but today it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It always smelled of pipe tobacco, old paper, and lemon polish. But today there was something else underneath it, a scent that reminded me of dried flowers and cold earth. The room was bathed in a golden, dusty twilight. And there, sitting in his favorite leather wingback chair by the window, was Uncle Arthur. He was wearing his favorite tweed vest and holding a small screwdriver. He looked pale, paler than usual. The sunlight hitting him didn't seem to warm him up. Instead, it made him look almost washed out, like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. "Uncle Arthur?" I whispered. He didn't jump. He didn't turn quickly. He moved with a slow, fluid grace that seemed almost too smooth. He turned his head and smiled at me. It wasn't a scary smile. It was the same kind, crinkly-eyed smile he always gave me. "Hello, Leo," he said. His voice sounded a bit distant, like it was coming through a long tube, soft and static-filled. "You should be napping." "I'm not tired," I said, walking further into the room. "I wanted to see the clocks." Arthur chuckled, a sound like dry leaves rustling together. "Time waits for no man, Leo. Not even for little boys who hate naps." He beckoned me over. I climbed up onto the ottoman in front of his chair. I noticed that the room was quieter than usual. Usually, the ticking was deafening. Today, many of the clocks had stopped. "I'm fixing the grandfather," Arthur said, gesturing to the massive 7-foot-tall mahogany clock in the corner. This was significant. That clock had been broken since before I was born. My dad always said the mainspring was snapped and it couldn't be repaired. "Daddy said it's dead," I told him. Arthur smiled sadly. "Nothing is ever truly dead, Leo. Just paused. Sometimes things just need a little push to start again." He handed me a small brass winding key. It was cold. Ice cold. "I want you to hold this for me," he said. "Keep it safe. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," I said, gripping the cold metal key tightly in my fist. We sat there for what felt like hours, but might have only been 20 minutes. He told me stories about the ocean, about how sailors used stars to navigate, and how time is just a circle, not a straight line. I didn't understand half of it, but I listened, mesmerized by the way the dust motes danced around his head. Suddenly, hearing footsteps thundering down the hallway, Arthur looked toward the door with a sharp, alert expression. "They're coming," he whispered. "You have to go now, Leo." "But I want to stay," I protested. "Go," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "And remember the key. Don't lose it." Before I could argue, the study door burst open. "Leo!" It was my mother. Her face was a mask of pure panic. My father and my aunt were right behind her. They looked like they had seen a ghost even before they looked into the room. I hopped off the ottoman, looking confused. "Shh, Mommy," I said, putting a finger to my lips. "You're too loud. Uncle Arthur is teaching me about the stars." The silence that followed that sentence was absolute. It was heavy, suffocating, and terrifying. My mother's face drained of all color. She grabbed the doorframe to steady herself. My father walked slowly into the room, his eyes scanning the empty leather chair where I had just been sitting. "Leo," my dad said, his voice trembling. Who are you talking to?" "Uncle Arthur," I said, pointing at the chair. "He's right there." But when I looked back, the chair was empty. There was no one there. The indent on the cushion was slowly rising back up, as if someone had just stood up, but Arthur was gone. "Leo, baby," my mother sobbed, rushing forward to grab me. "Uncle Arthur isn't here." "Yes, he is," I insisted, getting frustrated. "He was just here. He gave me the key." "Leo, stop it," my aunt cried out, tears streaming down her face. "Arthur died 3 weeks ago. That's why we're here. We're here for the funeral tomorrow." I froze. I was 5 and the concept of death was abstract, but I knew what died meant. It meant gone, like a goldfish. "No," I said stubbornly. "He's not dead. He fixed the clock. Look." I pointed to the massive mahogany grandfather clock in the corner. The adults turned to look. The clock, which had been silent and broken for 20 years, a piece of furniture my father had tried and failed to fix a dozen times, was working. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The heavy brass pendulum was swinging rhythmically behind the glass. The hands were moving. My father gasped and stumbled back. That's impossible. The mainspring. It was snapped in half." He walked over to the clock, terrified but compelled to check. He opened the glass face, and there, resting on the ledge inside the clock face, was a small pile of fresh pipe tobacco ash. I opened my hand. Resting in my sweaty palm was the brass winding key. It was an antique key, intricate and unique, one that my father had been searching for since he inherited the estate, but had never found. "He told me to keep it safe," I whispered. We left Blackwood that evening. My parents refused to stay the night in the house. We stayed at a motel in town until the funeral the next day. I'm 30 years old now. I inherited that grandfather clock when my parents downsized. It stands in my living room today. Every now and then, usually on hot, humid summer nights when the air feels heavy, The clock will skip a beat. Tick, tock. And when that happens, I catch a faint whiff of pipe tobacco and lemon polish. I don't get scared. I just smile and check the time, knowing that Arthur is just checking in, making sure that everything is still running on schedule. We tend to treat memory like a recording device, something that only captures what we physically experience. But there is a theory, whispered mostly by the superstitious and the very old, that memory is genetic, that it lives in the blood. They say that if a trauma is deep enough, or love is strong enough, it can imprint itself onto a lineage, allowing a child to remember a face they have never seen, or a voice they have never heard. I never believed in that theory. I'm a man of science, an architect by trade. I deal in blueprints and concrete reality. But there is one memory from my childhood, a single feverish night in the winter of 1994, that defies every blueprint I have ever drawn. It is the only structural flaw in my understanding of the world. I was 6 years old, living with my parents in a drafty 2-story colonial house in upstate New York. It was January, and we were in the middle of a blizzard that had buried the entire county under 3 feet of snow. The power lines had snapped 2 days prior, leaving us reliant on the wood stove in the living room and layers of heavy quilts. To make matters worse, I was deathly ill. I had contracted a severe case of pneumonia. My fever was hovering around 103 degrees. In a modern context, my parents would have rushed me to the ER. But with the roads completely blocked by snowdrifts and the phone lines down, we were trapped. My mother was terrified. I remember her pacing the hallway with a kerosene lamp, the smell of burning oil mixing with the scent of Vicks Vapo Rub that she had slathered on my chest. My bedroom was freezing. The only heat came from a small space heater that was useless without electricity, and the residual warmth drifting up from the wood stove downstairs. I was drifting in and out of delirium, the shadows in my room stretching and warping into monsters. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up. The room was pitch black, save for the blue-gray moonlight reflecting off the snow outside and filtering through the curtains. My throat felt like it was filled with broken glass, and my chest was so heavy I could barely breathe. I wanted to call out for my mom, but I couldn't make a sound. That's when I saw him. Sitting in the rocking chair in the corner of my room, a chair that was usually piled high with my laundry, was a man. He wasn't transparent. He didn't glow. He looked as solid and real as the bed I was lying in. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick-set. He was leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees, watching me. In my fevered state, I wasn't scared. When you are that sick, the boundaries of reality dissolve. You accept things you normally wouldn't. I assumed it was my dad coming to check on me, even though this man looked much bigger than my father. "Dad?" I wheezed, my voice a tiny rasp. The man didn't answer. He just leaned closer. I could see him clearly now in the moonlight. He was wearing an outfit that I found funny. It looked like a green dress to my 6-year-old eyes, but with pants underneath. It had buckles on the shoulders. He was also wearing a hat, a flat gray cap with a small brim that cast a shadow over his eyes. But the detail that stuck with me, the detail that I stared at with the intense focus of a child, was his hands. He reached out to touch my forehead. His hands were massive, like catcher's mitts, and they were dirty. Not just dusty, but stained with something dark and greasy. There was black grime impacted under his fingernails and smeared into the calluses of his palms. I flinched, expecting his hand to be rough. Instead, it was cool. It felt like placing a fevered cheek against a cold window pane. He rested that heavy, cool hand on my burning forehead. The relief was instantaneous. The pounding in my skull slowed down. The tightness in my chest loosened just a fraction. "Rest now, little bit," he whispered. His voice was deep and gravelly, like stones tumbling in a river. It didn't sound like my dad. It sounded old. It smelled like wet wool and peppermint tobacco. "You're wearing a funny green dress," I mumbled, my eyes drooping. The man chuckled, a low rumbling sound. "It's for the work, son. Just for the work." He kept his hand on my head until my eyes closed. I fell into the first deep, restful sleep I'd had in 3 days. When I woke up the next morning, the fever had broken. The snowplows had finally cleared the road, and the power was back on. My mom came into the room, looking exhausted and hag-ridden, expecting the worst. When she saw me sitting up, asking for juice, she burst into tears of relief. Later that afternoon, my grandmother, my mom's mom, managed to drive over to check on us. We were all sitting in the kitchen, drinking hot cocoa. I was still weak, wrapped in a blanket, but I was lucid. "You gave us quite a scare, kiddo," my grandma said, smoothing my hair. "I'm okay," I said. "The man made me better." The kitchen went silent. My mom stopped stirring her tea. My dad looked up from his newspaper. "What man, honey?" my mom asked, her voice tight. Did a doctor come while I was asleep?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "The big man, the one in my room last night." My parents exchanged a worried look. They thought I was hallucinating again. "It was just a dream, Ethan," my dad said gently. "There was no one in your room but you." "He was there," I insisted, getting annoyed. "He sat in the rocking chair. He had a flat hat on, and he was wearing a funny green dress with buckles." My grandma dropped her spoon. It hit the ceramic tile floor with a loud clatter. She stared at me, her face draining of color. "Ethan, what did you say?" "He had a green dress," I repeated, tracing the shape of straps on my own chest. "Like pants, but they went all the way up here. And he had a flat hat." "Overalls?" my grandma whispered, her voice trembling. "Was he wearing green overalls?" "Yeah, overalls," I chirped, happy to have the right word. "And he had dirty hands. He had black stuff all over his fingers and under his nails. But he smelled like peppermint candy." My mother looked at my grandmother, confused. "Mom, what is it?" My grandma didn't answer. She stood up, her hands shaking, and walked over to her heavy purse. She dug through her wallet and pulled out a small, tattered black and white photograph. It was so old the edges were crumbling. She walked over and placed it on the kitchen table in front of me. "Ethan," she said, her voice choking up. "Is this the man?" I looked at the photo. It showed a group of men standing in front of what looked like a factory or a mine. They were all unsmiling, grim-faced. But standing in the back row, towering over the others, was the man from my room. He was wearing a flat cap. He was wearing overalls. Even in black and white, I recognized the heavy set of his shoulders. "That's him," I pointed. "That's the green man. But why isn't he green in the picture?" My grandma let out a sob and covered her mouth. My dad stood up and looked at the photo, then at me, completely baffled. "That's my father," Grandma said, tears streaming down her face. "That's your great-grandfather, Silas." "I never met him," I said. "No," she shook her head. "He died in 1955, 30 years before you were born." She turned to my mother. "He worked as a mechanic for the John Deere plant." That's why his hands were always stained with grease and oil. No matter how much he scrubbed, he couldn't get that black grease out of his fingernails. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. "And the green dress. Ethan, his work uniform was bright Kelly green overalls. He wore them every single day. But..." She paused, tapping the black and white photo. "There are no color photos of him. None. We couldn't afford color film back then. And he was buried in his Sunday suit. There is absolutely no way you could know that his work overalls were green." I shrugged, taking a sip of my cocoa. "He told me they were for the work," I said simply. "And he smelled like peppermint." "Did he like peppermint?" My grandma laughed, a wet, teary sound. "He smoked a pipe," she said. But my mother wouldn't let him smoke in the house, so he would chew peppermint tobacco to hide the smell. He always smelled like mint and wool. The skepticism in the room evaporated. My father, the stoic realist, just sat there staring at the photo, rubbing his temples. My mother was holding my grandma's hand. We never talked about it much after that day. It was too strange, too impossible to fit into our daily lives. But I kept that black and white photo. I'm an architect now. I understand how structures are built. I understand load-bearing walls and foundations. But sometimes, when I'm working late and the house is quiet, I think about that night. I think about the impossibility of memory. I had never seen a picture of great-grandpa Silas. I had never been told about his job, his grease-stained hands, or his habit of chewing peppermint tobacco. And yet, when I was at my weakest, alone in the dark, he was there. It makes me wonder if the ones we lose are ever really gone, or if they are just waiting in the quiet corners of our lives, watching, ready to offer a cool hand when the fever of living gets too high to bear. There is a specific kind of silence that fills a house after a funeral. It's not peaceful. It's heavy. It's a vacuum, a negative space where a person used to be, sucking the air out of the rooms they once inhabited. You find yourself walking on tiptoes, afraid to disturb the dust, afraid to break the illusion that they might just be in the next room, reading a newspaper or brewing coffee. I was living in that silence in the winter of 2015. I had just moved back to my childhood home in coastal Maine to settle the estate of my grandfather, Elias. He had raised me since I was a boy, filling the role of father, mentor, and best friend. He was a stoic man, a retired electrical engineer who could fix anything with a soldering iron and a roll of duct tape. He wasn't big on emotional speeches, but his presence was a constant, grounding force in my life. When he passed away from a sudden stroke, it felt like the foundation of the house had cracked. I spent the first week just wandering through the rooms, unable to pack a single box. The house was exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses were still on the side table. His workshop in the garage still smelled of ozone and sawdust. It was a museum of a life interrupted. The incident happened on a Tuesday, around 4 a.m. I've always been a light sleeper, but since the funeral, I had developed severe insomnia. I woke up that morning with a jolt, my heart racing for no apparent reason. The house was freezing. The old boiler was acting up again, and outside, a winter gale was battering the coast. The wind howled around the eaves, rattling the window panes like someone trying to break in. I couldn't go back to sleep. I threw off the covers, grabbed a heavy wool blanket, and shuffled downstairs to the living room. This room was the heart of the house, and in the corner, facing the fireplace, sat the chair. It was an ancient, overstuffed brown leather recliner. The leather was cracked and worn smooth in places, shaped perfectly to my grandfather's frame after 30 years of use. It was his throne. Even now, 2 weeks after his death, I couldn't bring myself to sit in it. It felt sacrilegious. I sat on the sofa opposite the chair, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. The room was illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the sheer curtains. I stared at the empty chair. In the half-light, I could almost see him there. I could imagine the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest as he napped, the smell of his peppermint tobacco, the soft click-click of his knitting needles, a hobby he took up to keep his hands busy. The grief hit me then, sharp and sudden. It wasn't the dull ache I had felt all week, it was a physical pain in my chest. I felt incredibly, overwhelmingly alone. "I don't know how to do this, Pop," I whispered into the darkness. My voice sounded small and pathetic in the empty room. "I don't know how to fix the boiler. I don't know how to sell this house. I miss you." I waited, half expecting an answer, but the only sound was the wind screaming outside and the settling groans of the timber frame. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, and walked over to the recliner. On the headrest, there was a small, hand-stitched pillow that he always used for neck support. It still held the indentation of his head. I felt a sudden magnetic pull to touch it. I wanted to feel the worn leather, to smell the lingering scent of his aftershave. I wanted a tactile reminder that he had existed, that he wasn't just a memory fading into the ether. I reached out my hand. My fingers were trembling. As my fingertips grazed the cold, cracked leather of the headrest, the air in the room changed. It happened in a millisecond. The atmosphere suddenly became charged with static electricity. You know that feeling when you rub a balloon on your hair and you can feel the energy hovering above your skin? It was that, but intensified 1,000 times. The hair on my arms stood straight up. The air tasted metallic, like copper pennies. And then, the light show began. Every single light in the house turned on at once. Not just the living room lamp, I mean everything. The hallway chandelier, the kitchen fluorescents, the porch light outside, even the small reading lamp on the desk in the study. But they didn't just turn on. They surged. They burned with a blinding, white-hot intensity that was far brighter than the bulbs should have been capable of producing. It was like a flashbang had gone off inside the house. I gasped and recoiled, stumbling back onto the sofa. What the? Then the lights began to strobe. Flash, dark, flash, dark. It was rapid-fire, violent flickering. The hum of the electricity was deafening, a loud, angry bzzzt that vibrated in my teeth. The house felt like it was going to explode. My rational brain immediately went to power surge. I thought the storm outside had hit a transformer. I thought the old wiring was finally giving up. I expected to smell smoke or see sparks flying from the outlets. But amidst the chaos, amidst the blinding strobes and the deafening buzz, I didn't feel fear. I should have been terrified. If this happened in a horror movie, this would be the moment the demon manifests. Instead, a wave of warmth washed over me. It started in my chest and spread to my fingertips and toes. It was a comforting, heavy warmth, like being wrapped in a heated blanket straight from the dryer. It felt familiar. It felt like a hand resting on my shoulder. The flickering continued for exactly 10 seconds. I sat there, bathed in the chaotic light, tears streaming down my face, not from fear, but from a sudden, profound realization. My grandfather was an electrical engineer. He spent his life manipulating currents, fixing circuits, making things flow. If he was going to say hello, if he was going to reach across the void to tell me he was okay, he wouldn't knock on a door or move a cup. He would use the grid. "I hear you, Pop," I choked out, sobbing through the smile that was breaking across my face. "I hear you." As soon as I spoke those words, the flickering stopped. It didn't taper off, it cut instantly. The house plunged back into near darkness. The silence returned, rushing in to fill the void left by the electric hum. But it wasn't the same silence as before. The heaviness was gone. The vacuum had been filled. The room felt lighter, warmer. The oppressive atmosphere of the funeral home had evaporated, replaced by the comfortable, lived-in feeling of my childhood. I sat there for a long time, just breathing, waiting for my heart rate to slow down. Eventually, I got up and walked to the kitchen. I checked the breaker box in the utility room. None of the switches had tripped. I looked out the window. The streetlights were steady. The neighbors' houses were dark and peaceful. There was no power surge in the neighborhood. The surge had been localized entirely to my house. The next morning, I called an electrician, an old friend of my grandfather's named Miller, just to be safe. I didn't want the house to burn down due to faulty wiring. Miller spent 3 hours checking every outlet, every fixture, and the main panel. He came into the kitchen, wiping grease off his hands with a rag, looking perplexed. "Well, Julian," he said, scratching his head, "I've checked everything. The wiring in this house is old, sure, but it's impeccable. Your grandpa kept this system in better shape than the hospital downtown." "So, no reason for a surge?" I asked, sipping my coffee. "None," Miller said. "In fact, with the surge protectors Elias installed, what you described physically shouldn't have happened. The breakers would have tripped immediately." He paused, looking at me with a knowing glint in his eye. "You said it happened when you touched his chair?" "Yeah," I nodded. Miller smiled, a soft, sad smile. "You know, Elias always hated saying goodbye. He preferred to just fix things for you before he left." I sold the house 6 months later. It was hard to let go, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I kept the leather recliner, though. It sits in my apartment now. I haven't had a light show since that night. The electricity in my new place is boringly stable. But every now and then, when I'm feeling lost or overwhelmed, I sit in that chair. I place my hand on the worn leather headrest, and I close my eyes. And sometimes, just for a second, I can feel that static charge in the air, that metallic taste of ozone, and the warmth of a heavy hand on my shoulder, reminding me that the connection hasn't been cut. It's just been rewired. There is a strange, unspoken contract we sign when we move into an apartment complex. We agree to live just inches away from strangers, separated only by a few layers of drywall and insulation. We share their smells, their muffled arguments, and the rhythm of their footsteps. We learn the intimate details of their lives without ever learning their names. But sometimes, that thin barrier isn't enough to keep everything out. Sometimes, the things that haunt our neighbors don't respect the lease agreement, and they bleed through the walls to haunt us, too. I learned this the hard way in the autumn of 2019. I was living in a second-floor unit of a brownstone in Chicago. It was an old building, the kind with radiator heat that clanked in the night and floorboards that groaned under the weight of history. I was a freelance copywriter at the time, which meant my sleep schedule was erratic at best. I spent most of my nights awake, typing away in the glow of my monitor, while the city slept around me. For 2 years, the unit next to mine had been empty. It was a buffer zone of silence that I had come to cherish. Then, in late October, Mrs. Gable moved in. She was a quiet, frail woman in her late 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that always seemed to be looking at something just over your shoulder. She was polite, but distant. We exchanged pleasantries in the hallway, comments about the weather, the mail, the broken buzzer downstairs, but she never invited conversation. However, almost immediately after she moved in, the atmosphere in my apartment shifted. It started with the temperature. My bedroom shared a wall with her living room. Even with the radiator cranking out heat, my room became freezing. It wasn't a draft. It was a dead, heavy cold that settled in the corners of the room and seeped into the mattress. Then came the sleep paralysis. I had experienced sleep paralysis a few times in college, usually during exam week when I was stressed. But this was different. This wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. This felt targeted. It began happening 3 or 4 times a week. I would drift off to sleep, only to wake up an hour later, paralyzed. My eyes would snap open, staring at the ceiling, but my body would be dead weight. I couldn't move a finger. I couldn't scream. I could only breathe in shallow, panicked gasps. And every time it happened, I felt it. There was a presence in the room, a shadow. It was darker than the darkness, a dense void that would form in the corner by the closet, and slowly, agonizingly drift toward my bed. I called it the Sentry. It felt masculine, imposing, and incredibly protective, but not protective of me. It felt like a guard dog that had wandered into the wrong yard and was deciding whether or not to bite. One night, the paralysis was particularly bad. The sentry was hovering right over my chest. I could feel a weight pressing down on my sternum, crushing the air out of my lungs. I was mentally screaming, begging my body to wake up, when I heard a sound from the other side of the wall, Mrs. Gable's apartment. It was a soft, rhythmic thumping, like someone pacing back and forth. As soon as the pacing started, the weight on my chest lifted. The sentry dissolved into the shadows, almost as if it had been called away. I sat up, gasping for air, sweat soaking through my t-shirt. I looked at the clock. 3 a.m. The pacing next door continued for another hour. This pattern continued for weeks. I started to look like a zombie. Dark circles under my eyes, hands shaking from caffeine overdose. I began to dread going to sleep. I even considered knocking on Mrs. Gable's door to ask if she was okay, or if she had a relative staying with her who paced at night. But I didn't want to be the creepy neighbor, so I kept my mouth shut. That was a mistake. The climax of this nightmare happened on a Tuesday in November. It was raining, a cold, sleeting rain that lashed against the windows like gravel. I had come home from a late dinner with friends, feeling exhausted. I fell into bed around midnight and, miraculously, fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. But the peace didn't last. I woke up abruptly. The silence in the room was deafening. I tried to roll over to check the time, but I couldn't move. The paralysis was back. And this time, it was violent. It didn't feel like a weight on my chest anymore. It felt like I was being held down. I felt invisible hands gripping my wrists, pinning them to the mattress. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The fear was primal, electric. The sentry was there. But he wasn't in the corner. He was right next to my ear. I couldn't see him, but I could hear a sound that made my blood run cold. Heavy, labored breathing. It wasn't the slow breath of a sleeper. It was the ragged, desperate gasping of someone drowning. Inhale, rattle, exhale. I tried to scream, but my throat was closed tight. "Let me go," I pleaded in my mind. "Please, let me go." The presence felt frantic. It wasn't attacking me. It was shaking me? It felt like urgency, panic, pure, distilled terror radiating from this invisible force. Then it happened. From the wall directly behind my head, the wall I shared with Mrs. Gable, there came 3 massive sounds. Bang! 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 It wasn't a knock. It sounded like someone had taken a sledgehammer and swung it with full force against the drywall. The sound was so loud it vibrated through my headboard and rattled the picture frames on my wall. The sheer volume of the noise broke the paralysis instantly. I shot up in bed, screaming, my lungs finally filling with air. "Who is it?" Silence. The room was dead quiet. The heavy breathing was gone. The invisible hands were gone. The cold spot had vanished. I sat there in the dark, clutching my duvet, waiting for a response. I expected to hear Mrs. Gable yelling, or maybe the sound of an intruder next door. Nothing. Just the sound of the sleet hitting the window. I looked at my alarm clock. The red digits burned in the darkness. 3:17 a.m. My rational brain kicked in. She must have fallen, I thought. Or maybe she dropped something heavy. I debated calling the police, but the silence next door was absolute. No groans, no movement, and the terrifying presence that had been plaguing me for weeks was gone. The air felt light, empty. I convinced myself that I had hallucinated the loudness of the bangs during the transition out of sleep paralysis. It's a common symptom. Exploding head syndrome, they call it. Hearing loud noises as you wake up. I eventually laid back down, keeping the lamp on, and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up. I didn't go to work that morning. I felt sick, a heavy pit of anxiety sitting in my stomach. Around 10 a.m., I heard a siren. It got louder and louder until it cut off right in front of our building. I went to the window and saw an ambulance. A few minutes later, there was a commotion in the hallway. I opened my door just a crack. 2 paramedics and the building superintendent were standing outside Mrs. Gable's door. The super was fumbling with his keys, his hands shaking. "I haven't seen her in 2 days," I heard him say. "Her daughter called, said she wasn't picking up." They got the door open and went inside. I stood there, listening. I don't know why, but I knew what they were going to find. "Code Blue!" one of the paramedics yelled. They were in there for a while, but they didn't bring her out in a rush. They brought her out slowly, on a stretcher covered with a white sheet. Later that afternoon, I bumped into the superintendent in the lobby. He looked shaken. "What happened?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Heart failure," he sighed, lighting a cigarette even though it was a non-smoking building. "The coroner said it happened sometime in the middle of the night. Massive attack. She probably didn't even make it out of bed." "Do you know what time?" I asked. He looked at me, confused. "They estimated around 3 o'clock or 3:30 a.m. Why?" A chill went down my spine that was colder than any draft in my apartment. Did you see anything weird in the apartment?" I pressed. "Like signs of a struggle? Or damage to the wall?" "Damage?" The super furrowed his brow. "No, the place was pristine. Why?" "I heard banging," I whispered. "Last night. Loud banging on the wall." The super shook his head. "Impossible, kid. She was a tiny woman, and with the way her heart went, she wouldn't have had the strength to knock over a lamp, let alone bang on a wall." I went back upstairs and sat on my bed, staring at the blank white wall that separated our lives. I realized then what had happened. The paralysis, the sentry, the feeling of urgency. The spirit I had been feeling for weeks wasn't a demon. It wasn't a ghost haunting me. It was her guardian, something attached to her, something that watched over her. And last night, at 3:17 a.m., when her heart stopped, that guardian came to me. It pinned me down. It shook me. It screamed in my ear with that ragged breathing. And when I didn't understand, when I didn't wake up fast enough, it slammed against the barrier between our worlds 3 times. Bang, bang, bang! It wasn't trying to scare me. It was trying to wake me up. It was a desperate, frantic plea for help because the woman it protected was dying just a few feet away. And I did nothing. I sat there and convinced myself it was a hallucination. I moved out a month later. I couldn't handle the silence next door anymore. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep in my new place, and the house settles with a loud crack, I jolt awake, heart pounding, waiting for the third knock that I hope never comes again. There is a distinct difference between house noises and intelligent noises. We all tell ourselves that the settling of a foundation or the groaning of water pipes are just the symptoms of an old building breathing in the cold. But deep down, your reptilian brain knows the difference. It knows the difference between a floorboard contracting in the winter air and a floorboard creaking because weight has been applied to it. I learned to distinguish between the two during the winter of 2016, when I rented a split-level house in Boulder, Colorado. I had moved there for a 6-month contract as a software engineer. The house was on Aspen Way, a quiet cul-de-sac that backed right up to the Flatirons. It was beautiful, scenic, and isolating. The house was built in the late 70s. Lots of wood paneling, shag carpet in the bedrooms, and an electrical system that I assumed was just quirky at first. For the first 2 weeks, it was just the small things. I would come home from grocery shopping to find the hallway light on. I was meticulous about turning lights off to save on the heating bill, but I chalked it up to forgetfulness. Then it was the television. I'd be in the kitchen making a sandwich, and the volume on the living room TV would suddenly tick up. Not jump to max volume, but just tick, tick, tick 3 notches louder. I replaced the batteries in the remote. I checked the wiring. I told myself it was signal interference from the neighbors. But the quirks started getting specific. One evening in November, I was sitting on the couch reading a book. My laptop was closed on the coffee table. Suddenly, the screen lit up. The fan whirred to life, and the browser opened to the home page. I hadn't touched it. The mouse was on the other side of the table. I stared at it, the blue light illuminating the dark living room. My heart did that little stutter step of panic. "Okay," I said aloud, my voice trembling slightly. "Bad wiring, just bad wiring." But as the weeks went on, the activity escalated from electrical glitches to what felt like playful pranks. The blender would pulse once while I was in the other room, whir, and then stop. The radio in the shower would turn on to a static station while I was brushing my teeth. It never felt malicious. The atmosphere in the house wasn't heavy or oppressive like you hear in horror stories. It felt energetic, like a hyperactive child was running around pushing buttons just to see what they did. I actually started to get used to it. I started calling the entity Sparky. "Cut it out, Sparky," I'd say when the lamp flickered, and usually it would stop. We had developed a weird sort of roommate dynamic. I paid the rent, he messed with the voltage. But then came the night of December 12th. A blizzard had hit Boulder that afternoon. The snow was piled 3 feet high against the sliding glass doors, and the wind was howling through the canyon, rattling the window panes. I went to bed early, around 10 p.m., burying myself under 3 layers of quilts. The house was freezing, but I kept the thermostat low to avoid overloading the old furnace. I fell into a deep sleep, the kind you only get when it's freezing outside and warm in your bed. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. It wasn't a noise that pulled me out of my dreams. It was a smell. A sharp, chemical stench that burned the back of my throat. Rotten eggs. My eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black, but the smell was unmistakable. Mercaptan. The additive they put in natural gas. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I threw the covers off and scrambled out of bed. The smell was stronger in the hallway. Then, I heard it. Click, click, click. Whoosh. The sound of the gas igniter on the stove, followed by the soft roar of a burner catching flame. I sprinted down the hallway, adrenaline pumping so hard I could hear my pulse in my ears. I burst into the kitchen. It was lit by an eerie blue glow. All 4 burners on the gas stove were on high. The blue flames were dancing violently, licking the air, casting long, frantic shadows against the cabinets. But that wasn't the worst part. On the front burner, right over the highest flame, was a plastic cutting board I had left out after dinner. It was already melting. Thick, black smoke was curling up from the plastic, and droplets of molten white polymer were sizzling onto the metal grate. In another minute, it would have caught fire. And with the amount of gas pumping into the room, the whole house would have gone up like a matchbox. "No!" I screamed. I lunged forward, ignoring the heat, and twisted the knobs to the off position. 1, 2, 3, 4. The blue flames died instantly. I grabbed the melting cutting board with an oven mitt and threw it into the metal sink, turning on the water to cool it down. Steam and smoke hissed up into my face. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, gasping for air. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold myself up. The smell of gas and burnt plastic was choking me. I was terrified. But more than that, I was furious. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a flickering lamp or a loud TV. This was life or death. I spun around to face the empty kitchen. The air felt charged, static-heavy, just like it always did when Sparky was active. "Are you crazy?" I bellowed. My voice was raw, cracking with anger. "You could have killed me! Do you understand?" I waited. The house was silent, save for the wind outside. "Never!" I screamed, pointing a shaking finger at the stove. "Never touch this again! You do not touch the stove! You do not touch the fire! Do you hear me?" I was shouting at the air, feeling like a lunatic, but the anger was real. I felt violated. My safety had been breached. "If you do this again," I lowered my voice to a menacing whisper, "I will burn sage in every corner of this house. I will bring a priest. I will drive you out. Do not test me." The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of a child who has just been scolded by a parent and is standing in the corner, ashamed. The static in the air dissipated. The heaviness lifted. I spent the next hour opening windows to air out the gas, shivering in my coat, waiting for the house to explode. It didn't. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the living room with a baseball bat, watching the stove. The next day, nothing happened. The day after that, silence. For a week, the house was perfectly normal. No lights flickered. The TV stayed off. It was as if I really was alone. I started to feel a twinge of guilt. Had I banished it? Had I been too harsh? It was dangerous, yes, but maybe it didn't know. Ghosts don't breathe. Maybe it didn't understand that gas kills. Then, on Christmas Eve, I was sitting in the living room, wrapping presents for my family. I had put on a playlist of Christmas jazz on my phone, but the speaker was small and tinny. I sighed, struggling with a piece of tape. I wish I had some better music. Suddenly, the dusty stereo system in the corner, a relic from the 90s that I had never even plugged in, clicked on. The display lit up AUX. And then, crystal clear, the sound of Dean Martin singing Let It Snow filled the room. The volume was perfect, not too loud, not too soft. I froze. The tape stuck to my finger. I looked at the stereo, then at the kitchen. The stove was cold. The knobs were untouched. A slow smile spread across my face. "Thanks, Sparky," I whispered. The lights on the Christmas tree flickered once, a quick, happy blink, and then stayed steady. I lived in that house for another 4 months. Sparky never left. He still turned on the TV when his favorite shows came on. Apparently, he loved Jeopardy. He still turned on the hallway light if I came home late. But he never, ever touched the stove again. When I moved out in the spring, I did something that my friends told me was insane. I left a note on the fridge for the next tenant. It didn't say, "Beware of ghosts." It said, "The wiring is a bit quirky. If the lights flicker, just say hello. But tell him the stove is off limits. He listens better than you'd think."